where do you live in Minnesota?
I grew up in Northfield.
Don't say St. Paul. Okay. All right. Okay. Northfield is cool. Great. All right. Anybody?
North Carolina.
California. Okay. Where in North Clay?
Around Charlotte.
Okay. All right. One of my second job in journalism was actually in Durham.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I like North Carolina. I'm blessed. Anybody else? The Vans guy. The Vans guy who doesn't wear Vans. Like,
Well, that makes
okay.
sense, yeah.
Okay. All right.
Hey folks, welcome. Ooh, that's really live. Welcome to everyone here in Knight Hall and welcome to those online. My name is Rafael Lorente and I have the privilege of being the Dean of the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. I've been at Merrill College for almost 19 years. Over the years, I've seen our faculty, our students work on really ambitious projects. I've also seen them tackle the kinds of issues that matter if we are to be the journalists we want to be. The journalists who hold the powerful to account, and the journalists who tell the stories that otherwise don't get told. They've worked on stories about climate change, college student gambling, racial terror, and more. But this project, just wow, this project. In the wake of the killing of George Floyd, the Associated Press wanted to know how many others, how many George Floyds, how many people die at the hands of police in encounters where firearms are not involved, in encounters that are not meant to be deadly. 3 years, thousands of public records requests, lots of data crunching, and countless interviews later, and I'm probably minimizing this a bit.
And lots of money.
Money, don't forget the money.
Lots of money.
A team from the AP Frontline and the Howard Centers here and at Arizona State University have done what must have seemed daunting. They've answered that question, and in so doing, they have provided the public and policymakers with a kind of information that could and should save people's lives. This is public service journalism at its best. I cannot tell you how proud we are. Thank you to the AP, to our old friend Ron, to Frontline for working with our students and faculty. This evening you're going to hear from a terrific panel, and you don't want to hear from me, so I'm going to introduce them and go away. And I apologize in advance because I have a feeling I'm going to screw up a name, so I'm going to try my best. Moderating the panel is Ron Nixon, Vice President for Investigative Enterprise, Grants, and Partnerships at the Associated Press. Ron is also a member of the Howard Center's board, and for those who don't know this, one of the all-time good guys in journalism. On the panel, we have Reese Dunklin, an award-winning Dallas-based reporter on AP's investigation team and the lead author of the kickoff story for the Lethal Restraint Project. Andrea Headley is an assistant professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown University. Her past work has included improving police-community relations in communities of color, assessing the effect of race during use of force encounters, and evaluating body-worn cameras, among other topics. She was a visiting scholar of race, policing, and crime at the National Policing Institute. Serginho Rusblad is an Emmy-winning documentary filmmaker at AP and the editor of the Frontline film documenting police use of force, which airs April 30th. So my YouTube is recording, yours should be too. Sean Mussenden is the data editor for the Howard Center and one of the driving forces behind making Merrill College the gold standard for university-based data-driven investigative journalism, or as Kathy Best calls him, the data god of the Howard Center. Chayla Jacoby, Merrill College journalism grad, now working at the Frederick News Post. While working as a reporter in the Howard Center, Chayla was able to persuade a police officer involved in a death to talk about the circumstances and his training, one of the few officers to go on the record for this project. For those of you who haven't ever tried to do that, that's really hard stuff to do, so impressive. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ron, and I'm going to go sit with you guys.
you so much, Dee. So I just want just first of all say thank you to Kathy and the Howard Center for working with us. Dean, thank you, sir, for giving them the space and time to be able to work with us on this. I agree with you on the scale and scope of this particular project, and we're thrilled to be able to talk about it. So I'm going to kick it off here with Reese. And so Reese, could you give us a little background on how the project started and what were we hoping to accomplish when I should say, when you all pitched it?
It started back in the fall of 2020. Two of my colleagues, Mitch Weiss and Bert Moore, were kicking around an idea. I was at the time working on something else, waiting to join in with them. And I think the original tip was how some police involved deaths get masked when medical examiners and coroners use this diagnosis that's not widely accepted called excited delirium. And some people believe it's a way to explain erratic behavior, agitated state where people turn violent, and it can even be life-threatening. But a lot of major medical associations say that is not rooted in science, and it's really just a way to mask the police force. So, and excited delirium sort of surfaced with George Floyd. So we got to thinking, well, that's interesting. How many times does that happen across the country? And that's how a lot of projects I've been a part of start. You see one example of something that's really unique and interesting, and you say, well, how often does that go on? So to understand how it was ruled that way, you had to understand the force, you had to understand the incident. So we started to think, all right, well, where can we go to start to find these incidents we can look at? And you would think that there's a federal government data set that you could tap into, people who die at the hands of the government, that should be tracked, right? We quickly found out there wasn't a reliable, complete, accessible database. So we would have to go to the states. Some of the states keep some information, some keep absolutely nothing at all. So we just went on a hunt for records, and we went on a hunt for how you can find these incidents. We couldn't rely on the media reports like you could in shootings, because when someone dies in a shooting, it tends to get covered. It also tends to get flagged a lot more. If you remember about George Floyd, initially his death was ruled a medical episode, medical emergency. That's how a lot of these happen. So it's not obvious. And because it's not obvious in a police report, it may not be obvious to a reporter to put it into a news story. So we knew if we only went on media reports, we wouldn't be getting everything. So we just went on a hunt for records all over the country, and that was a ginormous effort. And so much went into it, and it was quite a slog. When we say 7,000 records requests, the Howard Center folks can attest to it. That's probably lowball. We were making a lot of different requests, and we had to fight to get the records in a lot of cases. But what you see online with our database is kind of the final fruits of that. And at least 1,036 deaths. And that's definitely the tip of the iceberg, because some states wouldn't release information. Their state laws allow this to be withheld. Anything that's an investigative police record. So we really just are scratching the surface, and we do hope this is the start of something else, and maybe we can keep building on this. But the original kernel was this tip. Hey, you ought to look at these crazy deaths that get called excited delirium. And we were like, well, what the hell is excited delirium? And that started to inform like, well, how often does this go on? Let's just keep looking and looking and looking and understanding the patterns. So that's kind of the short version.
Okay. Thanks so much, Reese. So, Sean, let me jump to you since we're talking about the data collection and in this case, the data simply didn't exist, and so we had to build this thing. Can you talk about the process for doing that, and also the uniqueness of it? Because having done data journalism for a good bit of my career, there's numerous ways to do it, but in this case, one of the things that I found really unique about the database is that it is based on all primary records.
Yes.
And that's something that I think was deliberate. So,
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great example of build your own database story. And, there's a lot of people who attempt to collect this kind of information, whether it's about shootings or whether it's about people who are killed in crashes with police. And as Reese alluded to, most of the time, it's media reports. That's how it's going. One thing that attracted me to working on this project instantly was the fact that primary source documents were the thing, and more than 300,000 documents, ultimately pages of documents that they obtained. So yeah, it was necessary for this in particular because there were, as Reese alluded to, a lot of these events went unreported. At some point, maybe 6 months ago, one of the editors on the project, Justin Pritchard, asked us to look at, okay, so how many of the deaths that we found were captured in other databases that other people have built. So there's some big ones out there that people use: mapping police violence, fatal encounters. The Washington Post has a really well-known one, all based on media reports. And something like close to 300 of these deaths were not mentioned at all or existed in any of these other databases. Really speaks to the information they were able to unearth, by persistently going back over and over again and getting records. That leaves about 700 that were known about in some form. But something else we found is that there was very minimal information about a lot of these cases. I found 30 cases in mapping police violence where the name wasn't even known of the person. And so we were able to, through a bunch of other details and some matching, link those up. And ones where names were known, information was still pretty slight. And what this project, I think, was able to accomplish is to bring a level of understanding of these cases at a level that nobody else has been able to do because nobody else has put in the work.
Okay. Dr. Hedlund, so let me go to you. And your research has been in policing and police encounters with communities, and just want to get a sense of what do you think the issue is here? Because it seems that if you watch, I watched a lot of the videos. Obviously I read all the stories before they were published, but it seems that there is this sense of someone calls and says, hey, I've got a relative who's having a mental episode, it's a medical condition, but the person ends up dead. Someone's having a seizure, but the person ends up dead. What's happening here in terms of the policing side of this?
Yeah, thanks for that question. And so I'd say there's a couple of things that are happening. One, I think it has to do with police training. And so, when you call 911, obviously police police come, EMS or EMT professionals come as well. But usually, right, when police are showing up to an incident, they are responding to an incident based on the things that they were taught. And when you look at training, estimates suggest between like 80 to 90% of police training is on force, use of force. And the training in general is also very limited that they get, right? So police officers aren't spending a year in training, for instance. And so when you think about that and you think about training as a tool that you can use, right, the tool is overwhelmingly made up of use of force. And so I think that's part of the problem. I'd say another part of the problem is what we know from the research in particular on how to, what can we do about use of force more broadly speaking. We do know that when you limit officer discretion, when there's accountability mechanisms in place, such as a supervisory review of reports on use of force incidents, for instance, like those have strong correlations with decreased use of force and decreased severity of force more broadly. And so I think it's coupled with these two things more broadly speaking, at least from the research perspective of what we know about training and then also what we know about how to reduce potentially use of force as a whole.
Let me just follow up on that.
Yeah.
You know, I'm gonna date myself, but there was I recall a movie that Denzel Washington was in. It's called The Siege. It's about a terrorist attack on New York before there was actually a terrorist attack on New York. But one of the characters in there said something I thought was interesting. It was on the other night. I couldn't sleep. But the president, the fictional president, wanted to bring the military in to deal with this situation because the FBI and police couldn't do it. And the character says, you know, the military is a broad sword. It's not a scalpel. And it just, as I thought about that, that seems to be apropos here. That, and when you talk about the training, like the training is not, it's not like surgical, right? This training is blunt force. Can you talk a little, just a little bit more about that? Also, the mindset that this happens if you're called out for something that you don't know how to deal with, other than to meet it with force.
Yeah. Let me say two things actually that I thought about when you were talking. And so one is more recently we have seen CIT training, so critical incident training, come about in law enforcement, which is particularly suited for teaching officers how to de-escalate situations, not use force as a first instant, use what people call like verbal judo, right? How can you use communication, interpersonal skills to de-escalate, particularly when you're engaging with populations who may be suffering from mental illness or there's drug or substance use involved. That is more recent in terms of kind of like how it's taken off in law enforcement. And the research that is on that specific type of training is so promising that oftentimes it leads to decreased uses of force. But, you know, it's not required for all police departments. Even within police departments, it's often not required for all police officers. And so it's a subset of officers that may be getting this training, if they're getting it at all, that then they have this additional tool, right? For the broad, you know, I'd say array of officers, it's the kind of typical tactical use of force. I'm perceiving everything around me as a threat. The culture of policing, there's a great book that just came out called The Danger Imperative, that talks about the culture of policing that kind of keeps officers on guard often. And you know, we can say it's for right or wrong reasons, right? That they often are going into situations where they should be on guard. They're putting their lives on the lines. That said, not every situation is that, right? And so how do you turn that off if you can at all? And some suggest that like the culture is so pervasive that it's very hard to turn that mindset off. The last thing I will say though is one of the pieces of research that I think is probably most consistent is the impact of women in policing. Broadly speaking, I mean, I haven't really been able to find any research that really contradicts in a strong way the fact that women are often better at de-escalating. They use less force, they use less severe types of force, and it doesn't pose additional safety risks to themselves. And so it's not like they're ending up more harmed or they're suffering a greater injury compared to their male counterparts. And so and yet they go through the same training, right? So they are also getting the same use of force training that their counterparts are getting, and yet they're responding differently. And so and oftentimes, at least the qualitative work when you talk to women officers, is that they are relying more on the interpersonal skills, right? And the kind of soft skills or emotional skills that they have to de-escalate, to engage in communication and things like that. And so that is the one thing I'd say, that, like, you know, this interaction of who the officer is, right? We can't separate identity and different characteristics from the type of training either.
Okay. Well, that's a good segue into in here, because you actually you got an officer who actually said that I wasn't trained properly on dealing with it. Can you talk a little bit about that? And also how you got him to open up?
Yeah, so Angel actually knows this story, but basically we got into contact with this officer. His name is Adam Slinsky. He worked for the Sylvester, Georgia Police Department at the time. And I had filed a public records request for his personnel records because those are subject to disclosure under Georgia law anyway. And he had somehow found out through the grapevine that I wanted his personnel records. And so he called the Howard Center. Angel happened to pick up the phone and he said, "Why do you want my personnel records?"
Wow.
And she explained to him, well, you know, we're doing this project, we're investigating, you know, fatal use of force incidents, and, you know, we just are pulling records from every case we can find in the state of Georgia, because that's where we were focused. And she came and she told the group that had happened, and that the officer turned out to be one of the ones that I was looking into. And Deb Nelson, who was kind of our leader at the Howard Center, said, well, why don't we just try to call him right now? And I was like, oh, right now? Okay. So we went down to Deb's office and called him on the phone. And I don't want to say that I like really had to persuade him much, actually, to speak to me. I found that he was actually pretty open about what had happened. So basically, he had been involved in a death of a man who originally the police had been called because he was acting erratically, knocking on neighbors' doors around the neighborhood, not really necessarily posing a threat to anyone, but seemed to be in some trouble. So the police showed up, and basically he told them when they arrived, you know, I have taken cocaine and I'm, you know, not reacting well to it, basically. And it ended up that they had handcuffed him, and he was placed in a prone position, which is one of the things that we found throughout our research that is just really a common thread throughout a lot of these fatal incidents, is that the person was put on their stomach with their hands behind their back. And at the time, there was actually guidance in the, you know, Georgia Public Safety Training Center documents that would suggest that, you know, you should really avoid doing it whenever you can, putting someone in the prone position, but it wasn't necessarily outlined specifically, do not do this. You know, it was more of a, you know, don't do this unless, you know, there's nothing else you can do. And so basically he said at the time, yeah, like I wasn't trained to not do this. And if I could go back, like I probably would have sat him up or laid him on his side or done something differently, because I just didn't know at the time. And it seemed to be something that really had kind of weighed on him for some time. And I will actually just note that the investigation that they did internally, I guess, had ended up that the individual, Terrell Clark was his name, died of a cocaine overdose. So it is not clear that there was an actual link between the two, but it has been shown in some of the research that the ASU students did, that there is, or there can be, a relationship between deaths in prone restraint and the use of stimulant drugs.
Right.
So that was also something that he had not been taught about the relationship between those sorts of drugs and the prone position and how that can increase the risk that somebody has a bad reaction or, unfortunately in this case, dies as a result of being put in that position. So yeah, those were some of the things we learned from him.
Okay.
But
Thank you. And thank you, and for picking up the phone. Yeah. Can we show like the trailer for the dog? If like, do we have that queued up? Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. Asking, you shall receive. Okay. All right.
The project is about uncovering hidden deaths.
In collaboration with the Associated Press, an investigation into police restraint.
You find so many families left with unanswered questions.
He could not have died.
People know about death in police interactions, but no one really knows the extent of it.
We're real-world practitioners, so we're dealing with a real-world problem.
It's important to identify what went wrong and who was responsible.
Stream now on PBS.
You can't actually stream now on PBS, but you will on Tuesday. All right, thanks so much. So I want to bring in the director of the docs, Serginho Rupai, who's also a member of the AP Global Investigations team. And I want, first of all, Serginho to talk about the film, but I also want you to talk about actually filming this documentary and going and talking to people who, some of them I know, the first time they actually understood what happened to their loved ones was when we told them. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So the film is indeed coming out on Tuesday, the 30th of April. And I'm right now at the Frontline at their offices in Boston, making the final tweaks to the film and seeing it all come together with the music and everything. So it's getting really exciting to see it all come together. And it's close to a year that I started working on this. And so by the time that I started working on the film, most of the reporters had already kind of like gathered a lot of the public records. So there was some sort of like idea already, at least from the police side, of what these incidents entailed, what had happened, at least in their words. And so what we started to do initially was to go to the families, and quite often those were also the ones who witnessed the incidents. And so the film focuses on four cases. One, Chaley was already mentioning, that was the case of Terrell Allen Clark in southern Georgia, who died after he was placed in a prone position, but also had a lot of like cocaine in his system and had a heart problem. But we focus on three other stories as well. And one of them is the case of Hunter Turner, who died in Bristol, Tennessee in 2017. His girlfriend called one night saying that, his girlfriend called 911 one night saying that he had a seizure. He was foaming from the mouth, and she didn't know what to do. She was in distress. And so the paramedics arrived first, and they couldn't get him into an ambulance. So they called law enforcement for assistance in getting him restrained and into an ambulance and bring him to a hospital. There was the incident got quite, I wouldn't necessarily say violent, but there was a lot of use of force from the police in order to get him restrained. They tased him. They tried to administer chemical sedation. They put him in what's called a hog tie. So it means that he was handcuffed, but also his ankles were handcuffed, and those were also tied together. And there was also a spit hood, what's called a spit hood, placed over his face, which should prevent people from biting and spitting at officers. That was placed over his head. So he was completely restrained and then placed in the ambulance. And then once in the ambulance, they realized that he was not breathing. So they tried to resuscitate him and brought him to the hospital, and where they continued for 30 minutes until his mother, who was there as well, who had witnessed part of the incident, because after the girlfriend had called 911, she called the mother, so the mother rushed to the apartment. So she saw part of the incident happening, rushed, followed the ambulance, and got to the hospital, where they were performing CPR. And after 30 minutes, she said, "My baby needs to rest now. It's enough," because she already had this idea that he had passed away. And so once he had passed and his autopsy came back, it said that he died from multiple drug toxicity, and that the drugs in his system were Suboxone, which is a drug that weans people off of opioids, and marijuana. And so for years, and sorry, and the manner of death was accidental. So meaning that no person had any involvement necessarily in his death, that it was purely the drugs. So this happened in 2017, and for years the parents believed, in their words, that it was a drug overdose. There's a slight difference between drug toxicity and a drug overdose, but for laymen, it's pretty similar. And so they thought for years he died of a drug overdose, until my colleagues from the Associated Press, Mitch Weiss and Kristen Hall, found this case and decided, and they also received the body camera footage, which showed there was a lot of force from the police and that it could have contributed potentially to his death. And so they went up to Bristol, Tennessee, which is like in the Appalachian Mountains, beautiful place. And they knocked on the door, and told them, the mother opened the door, and Mitch and Kristen told them, like, "Hey, we're reporters with the Associated Press. We have some questions about the death of your son, Hunter Turner." Initially, the mother was not very open to talk about what had happened to her son. But eventually they were able to have some sort of rapport, and they opened up. So they told them a little bit about what they had found, and that they had body camera footage, and asked them if they wanted to see it, which was the case. And so they went back a couple weeks later and showed the mother the body camera footage, which was, even though she was there, this was the first time that she saw it basically from the perspective of the officers. And so that was very hard for her. And so when we, as the filmmaker, and the filmmaking crew, heard about it, it was like, okay, well, we really want to be there as well. So we asked if we could be there and film while she was watching the body camera footage. That was something that she was not open to. But a subsequent visit, again, a couple of weeks later, which was on the anniversary of his death in August of 2023, I first went there with just myself and a camera, and filmed the first kind of, well, at least on camera, the meeting between the reporters and Karen Goodwin is her name. And there she opened up about how difficult it was, and especially that day, which was the anniversary. And through that, we had, she got more used to the camera, used, me being around. And then we went back again a couple weeks later with kind of like a full crew. So a second camera person, a photographer. And then we stayed there for a couple of days, and they were very big, or the family is very big on riding their motorcycles. And there are a couple of trails in the Appalachian Mountains which are beloved by people who ride their motorcycles. And so we went on a motorcycle ride with them. The Friends of Hunter Turner had made a roadside memorial along the route, one of his favorite routes. So we went with them there. And that's basically how we create, the bond kept on growing between us as journalists and them as, for lack of a better word, characters in the film, and them also learning more about what happened that night. And then we also took all of the documents that the reporters were able to unearth, including the body camera footage, to several experts, to several forensic pathologists and former medical examiners, and showed it to them. And they came with a different conclusion, that it was not an accidental death, and that from their point of view, if they would have ruled it that, they would have ruled it a homicide, and that the drugs in his system was too low. So for years, this family believed their son had died of a drug overdose or multiple drug toxicity. And it turns out that most likely, according to some of the experts that we've spoken with, it was not an accidental death, but it should have been ruled a homicide. And when a medical examiner rules a death a homicide, that doesn't necessarily mean that someone needs to go to jail or someone will be charged, but it means purely that this death was at the hands of another human being.
Right. So one other question for you. So when the film comes out on Tuesday, on Wednesday, does that mean I have to speak to your agent to like talk to you? No?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah. We'll all go through my agent.
Okay.
Yeah, all of that. But I don't know if I will even have time for you then.
Okay.
My agent
All
will
right.
be very
No,
busy with other
I'll
other
try
press
and-
requests.
I'll try and get on your schedule.
Yes.
Okay. Actually, let me go back to you in terms of, I saw an interview that you did. I can't remember quite where. I watched a bunch of them, not like a stalking kind of way, but you, in one of these interviews, you talked about police officers needing soft skills in dealing with community folks. Can you talk about what those soft skills are and where, if anywhere, is that happening now?
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. And so since that interview, I've actually started changing the language I use a little bit to say interpersonal skills because it lands better with officers, right? Instead of saying it's soft. But I think so, and really what I mean though is thinking about like this kind of human people to people skills, right? To going back to kind of what I was referring to a little bit earlier with so much of the training being around use of force, right? At some point you get used to kind of operating a certain way, as opposed to relying on a broader set of skills and tools that could be at your disposal, right? And so for me, for instance, as someone who doesn't know really how to fight well, for instance, I probably wouldn't be using my fist first, right? Like I'd probably be trying to talk to somebody. I'd probably be trying to assess the situation. I'd probably be trying to appeal to the person's emotions or what have you. There's skills that particularly think when we're thinking about communication skills, when we're thinking about empathy, when we're thinking about perspective taking, right? In thinking about kind of like the science of psychology, but particularly how you use that as skills. Like it's not just about talking about emotions and the touchy-feely type of things. It's framing these things that these are skills that you can use in interpersonal interactions to deal with people, to engage people, to de-escalate people, to understand a situation, to get information that you can rely on that don't necessarily have to lead to or involve physical restraint tactics. And you know, whether that's happening, I think there's definitely like de-escalation training is something that oftentimes talks about the verbal judo, right? Communication as a means to de-escalate, going back to the crisis intervention training, but it's not happening to the extent to which I think use of force training is happening, for instance. And so for me, particularly as someone who, you know, studies public policy, who studies really trying to make an impact from policies, management, organizational structure, what I'd like to see is more emphasis on that, right? What I'd like to see is like how you're actually teaching people how to use these skills, understanding what they are, showing how it can be beneficial, giving them practice with using those skills in the same way in which they practice use of force techniques, for instance. And so those are some of the skills. I would also say the one other one is cultural competence. You know, how there is clear research that shows that perceptions of threat, particularly for normal individuals, like people that are not officers as well as police officers, they perceive threat differently depending on the race of the individual, right? And so what the same types of behavior that a white individual does versus a black individual versus a Latino or Asian or what have you is perceived differently. And there's clear associations, oftentimes incorrectly, about, you know, who's carrying a weapon and who's not, right? And so I think there's a cultural element that matters here too, right? Along with kind of checking the stereotypes, the biases, et cetera, that you have, and then how you deploy the interpersonal skills in situations.
So Reese, you know, as we're doing a lot of this, I mean, looking at some of the body cams, you can see that the officers were like aggressive, right? But in some of them too, it actually started out fairly well, right? Like the officers did try to, like, you know, de-escalate the situation, but something happened and it just went off the rails. Can you talk about that in some of the cases that you guys reviewed? You're muted, Reese.
It got me. It got me. I was not gonna let that happen. Yeah, sometimes the cops were trying to take it at a normal pace and asking questions and basic um intel. And the moment where it would often begin to go off the rails, and it would especially happen with those with mental illness, severe mental illness, it would be when the officers would decide, I want to cuff this person for my safety. And they would go to handcuff the person. And apparently those with severe mental illness, there's something called a touch trigger, where some of them don't like to be touched. And so the officer would do that, the person would tense up, and then the officer would perceive that as, you're about to get aggressive with me, you're about to get combative, so I need to be preemptive and get combative with you. And it was this sort of one-upsmanship. It probably isn't the right way to put it, but it's, someone's trying to get the upper hand. And that's generally when you would start to have a struggle that would then begin to turn violent. And there's one case out of California where this happened, where a guy had caused a commotion in a grocery store. And he was legitimately acting disruptive, but he didn't hurt anybody. He leaves, the store calls the police find him maybe a block away walking. And initially he's answering their questions, and then he just gets quiet and he won't respond. And the officers decide, we've had enough of this. If he's not going to respond to us, we're just going to cuff him, and we'll basically force him to answer our questions. And sure enough, when they went to touch him, he pulls his hand away, and they start yelling. He starts running. They tackle him, and the scrum is on. Other officers respond. Like 6 people get on top of the guy. They're tasing him, getting very forceful. So it can begin like in a blink of an eye. And sometimes it looks like everything's going well. You have the verbal judo, you have someone who's de-escalating, but maybe the officers misread the situation, and they don't understand. Someone with severe mental illness can't necessarily comprehend a command like an average person. If you're schizophrenic, you may be hallucinating. You may be hearing sounds where it comes across like a monster or something. So when an officer says, put your hands behind your back, the schizophrenic's not hearing it that way. So if you haven't had that training, you just assume the person's being belligerent. Why aren't they listening to me? Why aren't they respecting the badge? I'm gonna force the issue. And what the doctor was saying earlier, there is this term kind of called warrior versus guardian in policing. And it's kind of philosophical. Some officers believe, I'm the warrior. I am here to kick ass and take names, and I have to control this situation immediately. By whatever means necessary. And if you don't follow my command, it's on you. And then there's the other side where it's guardian, where you are here as a peace officer. You're here to protect the public, protect and serve. And, thinking back to that, there's a lot of cases where you could tell that officer was a warrior, and that's why that case went south fast. And that's after watching these over and over and over. You can almost begin to see like, uh-oh, it's about to go bad. It's about to go bad. Yep, there it goes. So I hope that answers the question. But yeah, in these videos, you can kind of see, uh-oh.
Okay. So Doctor, I'm going to put you back on the spot again. And then I want to talk about how journalism of this scale works. So we'll get to two of you and Reese. Yeah. The thing that you're talking about, though, the training and what Reese is mentioning, that costs money. So does it not, right? And you already have police forces that are like, I mean, typically in most places, the police are more well funded than, say, schools or something, right? But there's still, this is an extra cost that has. How much does that factor into all of this? Because I need the bullet, I need the taser, I need the spray, I need all of those things. This is kind of extra.
I think the biggest cost in particular is for, or at least the biggest cost that police departments articulate would be taking their officers off the streets, right? And then, because it's not necessarily like to bring in someone to do the training is that expensive, but it's like the time it takes to take officers off the streets. And usually it's like, police departments are short officers and overtime is a lot and all the things, right? And so in terms of that, it is costly. I think the thing though, that I would probably argue is that, and I think this came up in some of the research that I read online with regards to the project of like the settlements that families also get from some of these incidents, right? Like there's a cost that people are paying no matter what to this, right? Whether it's a financial cost up front that the department's paying or the government's paying on the end, right? Or the, non-monetary costs that we can kind of think about when we think about the families and things like that. And so there's a cost that's paid no matter what. But oftentimes it's not articulated in the same ways, or the numbers aren't put together so that we have this complete story. The last thing though I'd say is I do think that, at least from thinking about some of the things Reese was just saying, and it's not directly answering the cost question, but one of the things to me that really stood out from this project, from the data, from the findings and things like that, was particularly related to the conversation happening now with regards to co-responder models, with regards to taking money and investing it in community resources, behavioral health, and things like that. Because of the overwhelming majority of cases were with individuals who were suffering from mental illnesses or had drug or substance use issues, right? Like how we can kind of invest in resources and support that doesn't necessarily require policing, right? And so police can focus on the incidents that do require police, and there's other parts of the government that then can be responsible for focusing on behavioral health calls or behavioral health issues. And so I think there are ways to like narrow in the scope of policing that kind of focus them in, not to say that they still don't need the training, right? But also give services to individuals that are better trained or equipped to handle these in the first place.
Okay, great. So let's then talk about, the dean alluded to this in the beginning, just the scale of something like this. So, Don Kaylee, can you two talk about like working on this project, and how old were you when you started on this project? So, but yeah, just talk about that, and I guess your initial thoughts when like, okay, we're gonna work on this project. And
I mean, a big part of the Howard Center's mission is to work with national partners on big projects. So this seemed like a natural. There were a bunch of different ways. Students and faculty here participated. Something close to 200 students at a school that's only 500 people were part of this effort. We had people filing public records requests as part of their media law classes. We had students who were doing a lot of data analysis works. Show of hands here who worked on this project, who's in the audience.
Well, okay.
All right. Several of you. We had students who were doing building tools, doing data engineering work. Part of the aim was to help the reporters at the AP and our reporters be able to more easily explore the massive amounts of documents and data. 300,000 documents is a huge thing to go through, and we had students who helped make that a little bit easier. And then of course we had students like Chaley doing original reporting. So
yeah, so I obviously not have anything to do with the data side of the project, but I kind of came into it with the understanding that I would be doing some original reporting, some writing. So I started on the project tying up loose ends with public records requests. So people before me had filed a bunch of requests. I and my classmates were tasked with chasing down the few that they couldn't find. Eventually that led us to kind of hone in on just a few cases that we had come across while harvesting data that really just stuck out in terms of whether there were multiple types of force used, what the manner of death was ruled, what the cause of death was ruled, all of those sorts of things that, and we looked for themes basically. So one of the themes that we identified was people experiencing behavioral health, mental health challenges, substance abuse issues, deaths that were ruled excited delirium. One of the maybe not so surprising takeaways was oftentimes it was Black men who were the victims of these incidents. And so we kind of honed in on these few cases. I interviewed attorneys, public information officers for different police departments. I interviewed sheriffs, I interviewed police officers. I reached out to family of people who had died in these incidents. I interviewed them, and it sort of all culminated in me and actually a couple different teams of student reporters actually going down to Georgia, where a lot of our research was focused, and doing some on-the-ground reporting with those people, talking to people in the community, advocates, anybody who really knew anything about these cases, because we were really trying to put together all of these different puzzle pieces in terms of the, GBI reports, Georgia Bureau of Investigation reports, interviews with officers, interviews with public information officers, interviews with attorneys, interviews with family, and trying to just create the narrative of what actually happened. And I think in most of these cases, like, it was not known before we got there. It had not been reported, and there was very little to go on besides what people before me had very diligently, uncovered.
Hey, Ron.
Yeah.
Hey, to piggyback on what she said and to what Serginio had said about the Turner case, that's a perfect example of a case that nobody knew about. And if you go looking online, all there is a very generic online obituary for this guy. And the way we found it is interesting, and it may be instructive for the student journalists in the crowd. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation had told us when we first went to them, hey, we have some annual report online that'll have all your data. And all it was like a couple of graphics with some numbers in there. So we began filing these requests saying, no, we want the raw data. We want the underlying information that you collected. And after 3 or 4 different requests, they would just come up with these cockamamie explanations for why we couldn't have it. Like, oh, the sky was blue the day you filed this, it has to be green for us to give it to you. And then they had another rule like, oh, you have to be a resident in Tennessee to have it. So then that's what got us going and talking to Kristen Hall, who you'll see in the documentary. So after some more haggling, she was having a phone call with some flack at the agency, and that flack, who apparently wasn't aware of what the lawyers were telling us, the reasons why we couldn't have it, the flack told Kristen, oh, sure, I'll go get that for you. So then she goes and gets it for it. Well, she says she's going to go get it, and then she comes back and says, I don't think I was supposed to tell you that I could get that for you. And Kristen said, sorry, you've already promised you have to give it to us. So she gave it to us, and then when we look at the raw data, it didn't have the deceased person's name, but it said the location of the city, the agency involved, the date that it happened. It had all these context clues. So we went to all those agencies and said, and put in request.
Okay.
And we'd say, on this day, someone passed away. Can we have those records? So Bristol, Tennessee turned over the police records and it revealed Austin Hunter Turner. So then we said, after reading the records, there's video. Can we have the video? And there was more haggling. And the person in Bristol sent us the video and then hours later said, can you return that to us? We weren't supposed to give that to you. And we said, yeah, no, that's your fault, not ours. And the explanation they gave is, well, in Tennessee, there's a law that says the inside of an ambulance is a medical facility. And we consulted our attorney and decided we're not turning that over. And that becomes the video Sergio features in the film that shows the force and that we show the family. And when the family sees what really happened, they were just like dumbfounded. And so it just all goes back to sometimes you have to make yourself an absolute nuisance with these agencies. And you get told once, no, we'll try it again, try it again, try it again. And then maybe you just get lucky and somebody makes a mistake and gives you something they shouldn't have gave you. But the backstory on Turner is like, that's one that not only was it hidden, but it was kind of serendipitous that even we got to it.
Thanks, Reese. And to one of Reese's points here, there are states where you have to be a resident of that state to actually file a public records request there. One of the benefits of working for an organization that actually has people in every state. So Christian Hall that Reese mentioned is actually based in Nashville, right? And so
yeah.
Because so she's a resident there, and she was able to get it. So Eugenio, let me come back to you since I still have your attention before the agent steps in on Wednesday. What do you hope that people will get from the film as they watch it? And also, Reese, I'm going to come back to you on something too about tone and how the journalism was done. But Sergio, so why don't you do that? Like, what do you hope that people get when they sit down, they see the film? What do you hope they take away from it?
I hope that they will take away that this is not an anti-police film to begin with. This is not, us saying like they're wrong all the time and all of that. I see this film kind of as a story about human interactions gone wrong. It's a data story as well, but with a lot of human and emotional elements. And I hope that will come across. And I, at the same time, I also hope that people will understand that, and I think that Dean alluded to it already, that this is a public service, and this allows for the public to understand the scale and the scope of these types of interactions and these types of deaths and what happens in the aftermath. What the reporters have found and what they've told me that quite often families also don't have an idea. The federal government doesn't have an idea. So I hope that watching this film, the public will get that. And at the same time, also researchers and even the government and law enforcement have a better understanding what happens in these interactions. Like, we're already talking about training of a couple of things. Like, for example, one of a trainer that we spoke to who was in the film told us that, and we didn't have that bit in the film, but yeah, when I grab you by your shoulder and you tense up, then I know you have something up your sleeve. I hope that after watching this film, he and others like him will understand that that's not always necessarily the case. And the same goes for example, prone position. In and of itself, it might not be a wrong thing to do to put someone on their stomach and handcuff them, but then there is like, what do you do after? Or when you, as an officer, already notices like, oh, this person is acting in some sort of way, there might be drugs on board. I need to be extra careful. So that's kind of what I hope the film will do.
Okay. So Reese and Haley, let me ask both of you about like the tone of the articles, right? As Reese mentioned, it's not a condemnation of law enforcement, right? It's sort of straightforward, just the old dragnet thing, just a fact, right? So can you guys talk about that and why? Okay, I dated myself with dragnet, um, but can you talk about that and because I know that in some of the responses, recent, particularly some of the emails that were forwarded to me, some of the people who were responding positively to the project were actually in law enforcement, right?
Yeah, I was fully prepared for a lot of blowback, but I think we worked really hard to try to be balanced. And one thing we make very clear is that in a number of these cases, the police were responding to violence underway, and they had a choice to make. Do I save this person's life, or do I wait to de-escalate? In those certain circumstances, they had to go in and save a life. And yet in a number of cases, it's really hard to explain why it all went south. Um, and so I think that was important for us to let people know the context, because sometimes you'll see, those viral videos of something on a police use of force,
Right.
and you have the person say, yeah, but what was the guy doing before the video started?
Mhm.
So we anticipated people were going to say, yeah, but. So that's why we answered it in the data. And when we built the database, we tried to create questions and variables that would help us understand that. And I think it paid off in the balance that we showed. And we had a story by Bert Moore and Jeff Martin that looked at one of those cases of violence underway. And the officers spoke and they talked about the dilemma they had. Do I save this innocent person, or do I get forceful? And even when they got forceful, rather than using their guns, they used their tasers. So we tried to give officer voice. And we also made clear statistically, this is about 2 deaths a week. And we made that clear in the article. And you can decide whether you think that's a lot or whether you think the cops' batting average is pretty good. Our approach was, let's go collect the data. Let's not cherry pick what we study. Let's just go get all of the information on all the deaths and see what the data says. And then my approach is, whether you think the cops are always right or always wrong, at least you have information out to build your case, build your argument. So that wasn't there before this project. At least there's information and we can start to build from here.
Thank you, Reese.
Yeah. So to your question, how we kind of tried to incorporate the perspective of law enforcement in this. One thing that our kind of Howard Center cohort of people really focused a lot on was training and how that kind of plays into the equation, where you have officers in many situations who truly believe that they are doing the right thing, that they're following what they were trained to do, they're, going by the book, so to speak, and what they're actually being trained to do, what they're being taught to do by superior officers or by trainers is something that is dangerous, and it's something that might not actually be based in any science. When it comes to things like excited delirium, they are trained that that is an actual condition, and they are trained how to respond to that, and that things like that, where officers are being told the wrong thing from the top down. It is not always a situation where you have just bad cops out in the field. There certainly are, and I think our investigation also turned up plenty of those cases where there were people who just probably should not have been in policing as a profession, and probably did pose a danger to their communities. But there were also these cases like the Selinsky case, where officers were trained to do something that was not safe, And that is, I think, something that this project really underscores is like, how do we fix this as a system and not just as individual officers that we need to get off the force?
Okay. That's how we do that time.
10 minutes.
Okay. 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 All right. So let me stay with you. How did you feel working on a project? I mean, you're in school at the time, but did you feel like a student, or did my colleagues here treat you as just another reporter on the project?
I was pleasantly surprised how involved we were. I wasn't really sure going into it, whether we would just kind of be doing the grunt work or whether we were actually going to get to do some hands-on reporting. And I can say at the end of it, like, yes, I did feel like I made meaningful contributions, and I really do feel like the experience kind of gave me a sense, especially as somebody who had a good half of my college experience kind of interrupted by the pandemic. Having that experience of actually being able to be in a newsroom around real reporters, something that I didn't get to do during my internships in college, actually do field reporting, which again, I didn't get to do during, a lot of my prior experiences in journalism. I do really feel like they made an effort to make all of the students feel involved. We were all credited on the project, which is fantastic. Wasn't sure about whether that was going to happen either, but yeah, I think that as a student working on this project, like, I just was able to take with me a lot of lessons into my career as a professional journalist, which I'm only like 10 months into, but
Just
And
quickly.
can I say something as well?
Sure.
You're also credited on the film, by the way.
Oh.
I don't know if you knew that, but
Neat.
yeah, your name is in the credit list, credit roll at the end. And because of you, we've been able to speak with Officer Solinsky. So, and that's major in the film. We don't have any other officer really, aside from a trainer, but someone who's actually out there on the street speaking to us. So yeah, I want to say thank you very much at this take this opportunity.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So at the Oscars, just make sure that I get a seat, right? Okay. Okay. Well, listen, we're gonna. I'm gonna stop talking here and just open it up for all of you. First of all, thank you for all the panelists. Thank you for the wonderful conversation here. I hope that people have gotten as much out of it as I did, because I'm kind of involved, but a lot of this stuff is actually new to me as well, because I was not involved in the day-to-day stuff of it. But hey, Reese, how much did those records cost?
Oh, I don't know. I don't think all that much.
just,
No,
just
yeah, I think 39,000 is
Okay.
probably, I mean, that's what we came up with, but it wouldn't shock me if it was more than that. And that's maybe another thing about all this that you have to think about and consider is that, yeah, there is a financial cost, and you have to be in an organization that's willing to say, we will take that on. And I know Maryland and the Howard Centers, you guys put in a lot of money too. I mean, it's a commitment, and you have to really want to do it. And thanks to AP and the Howard Centers, they were willing, because some of these governments really charged an arm and a leg for records and video.
Right.
And Reese, that also goes for families as well. I think one of the reporters, Ryan Foley, was telling me a couple of weeks ago that there was a family that couldn't even afford $30 to pay for the body camera footage of the incident where one of their loved ones died, and the AP was able to get those records and eventually share it with the family. But it's hard for families out there to, if they want to get answers of what happened that day when their loved one passed away, like, oh wait, you have to navigate this very difficult system, and you gotta have to pay for it on top of if you want to even get a lawyer to help you out as well.
And let me just one other thing that I want to say to our partners at PBS Frontline. Erica Howard is the representatives here from the organization. Want to thank them because this has been a very fruitful partnership. We've worked with Frontline on what 6, 7 films now. But it almost feels like a marriage now that we've worked with them on so many things, from Emmy Award winning things to Peabody's to an Oscar. It's been a great partnership, so thank you all for just being really great partners on this, and then taking this guy and turning him into a superstar. So all right. So with that, I'm just gonna open it up. Yes, sir.
I came in late. This has already been published.
Sure.
The AP was on this sometime, and then Merrill came into it. What was the I then? What did the AP give them?
Okay. I think I can answer that one. The AP is big. It's massive, right? It's in 250 locations around the world, all 50 states. It's in 100 countries, right? But for something like this is a massive undertaking that no one media organization can actually take on by itself. And so I'm on the board of the Howard. Actually, I'm on the board of both of the Howard Centers. I don't know how that happened, but I'm on the board of both of the Howard Centers.
There's a wrong answer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But actually, though, I will credit Justin Pritchard, who was the editor that steered the project. Actually came up with the idea by talking to Maud Billman, who is the founding director of the Howard Centers for Investigative Journalism at Arizona State University. And Maud was a former AP investigations editor. So he was asking, Maud was like, hey, would you guys want to jump in on this project? And she was like, sure. And then I think the outreach went to Kathy, and it just grew from there. And so I know you didn't ask this last part of this, but then, Frontline created this program to bring in like young filmmakers or filmmakers, and Serginho was one of the first fellows there. And so when we were trying to decide what film we were gonna, what we were gonna do for a project, and we were like, oh, okay, well this one. So I talked to Rainey Aronson, the editor-in-chief and the executive producer of Frontline, and we're like, well, this is perfect because it fits everything. We give Serginho a project, we do another film together. And so that's how all of those pieces came together to do this project. And so Frontline just didn't do, like, it's not just doing the film. If you look at the interactive digital story that, I would encourage you, if you haven't seen it, to see it. Dan Nolan, one of the designers at Frontline, did that. So again, it's like this perfect synergy of all of these different newsrooms pulling this stuff together, because again, this is not something that a single newsroom can do. Not something of this scale. And 7,000 records requests, 300,000 individual document. That's a massive undertaking. Yeah.
One follow-up, did you have something with data? We need someone give us full of data. Go to university.
Yeah.
It started that way, but we just sort of presented it as, hey, we can do these things. Would this be useful? And it grew from there.
Yes.
And it was absolutely essential to have y'all's data help.
Yeah.
I'm one of the graduate students. I had a question for like anybody who did any work. Can you talk a little bit about like times where you got stuck and like how you got unstuck during your reporting?
Okay. Reese, you wanna take that?
Stuck with the reporting or stuck with the writing?
More on the reporting side, like was there anything that came up that just was like a really big challenge that you had to overcome or a way around and that you had to get?
Yeah, I think the Turner case is a good example of the reporting because the legal office for that department just did not want to pony up the information. And I did. I mean, I sat there and played amateur lawyer several times to get around them. That would be one case. And actually, when we approached the family, we had multiple conversations about how to go about it. And we did that because in a different case, in a different state, we had tried to get to the family and they were reticent and they were a little put off and they felt like, who are you media people coming here trying to open up my wound? And so we knew with Turner it was a very insightful case, so we had to be delicate when going to the family. So we had multiple conversations so we didn't get the stiff arm from them. And we talked about how to be gentle, not go in like, an aggressive reporter, like, hey, give me a quote. Hey, give me a 2-hour interview, or hey, look at this video. Tell me what you think. We had an approach to make as many trips as we needed to get them to feel comfortable with us. We wanted just to have conversation. We didn't want to pull out notepads. And that's what Mitch and Kristen did the first couple times that they went there. And then gradually, when they felt comfortable with Mitch and Kristen, then Mitch and Kristen were able to say, hey, our friend Serginho, he's doing a video. How would you guys feel about, meeting him? And, so we just played the long game with them and tried to build rapport. Because you are dealing with people who have been traumatized. They may not associate themselves with trauma. They may not self-identify with that, but they have been through something rough. And we wanted to treat them with care. We weren't just there to grab a quote and stick it in our story and move on. We were trying to just be more respectful. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I guess one thing to think about is, you're not always going to get it the first time, the first call, the first email. And you have to be thinking a couple steps ahead. Like, well, when they tell me no on this request, I'm going to file this request and this request. If we knock on the door and the family says no, we'll come at them this way. We'll send them a letter. We'll do this. You just can't take the first no.
Thanks, Reese. Let me take a question over here. I neglected this item, so let me. Yes.
I'm Kira. I'm just an undergraduate journalism student. My question, I guess, was: have you guys seen any changes already in terms of police or other groups saying "Hey, I've seen this data, I've seen everything that's going on, and I want to make a change"? Or do you think that's more very long term and it's going to take a couple months, 4 months, years, or anything to see that actually?
Yeah, I think it's probably going to be a little long term, but there was one policing agency was talking to one of our colleagues, John Sewer, and we weren't sure how this police agency would fall. You know, they do a lot of research and a lot of training. And we kind of knew, and we've been told police do not like to be Monday morning quarterbacked. They don't like to have someone else tell them, you know, what you really ought to do is beef up your training. Um, and but the head of that agency wrote back a very thoughtful note saying, "Wow, you guys have done a lot of work. This is something we really need to consider, and you know, maybe we need to go back and come up with, you know, some policy recommendations. We need to do something to spread the word." And then there's been, I know I was conversing with one former cop and police training expert where he said, wow, you know, I feel like finally somebody has heard all of my shouting in the woods. I've been trying to tell people, hey, this less lethal force, it can be deadly, it can kill. And, you know, you guys writing about this, I think, is going to expose people and get the industry thinking about better practices. So, you know, it's not necessarily simple in all cases to fix, and you have a reluctant audience in policing. And there's not a simple government fix either, you know. It's going to take a little bit of time to figure out the sweet spot. So, you know, maybe later this year, we really begin to hear some serious momentum towards something. But I think it will take a little bit.
Can I add just one thing
Yes.
really quick?
And can I, oh, no, go ahead, go ahead.
Go ahead.
The one thing I would say is, you know, I hope, and I'm very hopeful actually, having seen at least the preliminary things on the website, that it will lead to change. But my hope is that training doesn't become the thing that it is the only thing that's talked about. When I look at this, it's actually reveals so many issues in the larger system, and like that how hard it was to access the data, the lack of accountability, the lack of repercussions, like so many things that I think there's so many areas that this could impact in changing the entire system, not just this focus. And one thing I was talking to Erica about, though, it's not necessarily related to a direct result of the work that was done here, but right now Colorado is considering legislation on restricting the use of the prone position tactic, right? And so it's under consideration. And so I'm very hopeful that once more media attention comes around this, right, that we will see at least things being considered in terms of legislative change.
Eugenia?
Yeah, and I wanted to say about the change that we've seen. I would say like a small change that we've seen was the family of Hunter Turner. They're a very conservative family, very pro-police. And so already once Mitch and Kristen knocked on their door, it was already a question like, hey, how are they going to talk? And then are they going to talk to, well, personally me being both Black and an immigrant, but they opened up because they saw, you know, how we approached them. And they were particularly, the stepdad of Hunter was particularly not a big fan of the Associated Press. And he told me that, like, yeah, when you were here, I was like, I don't want you here. And he opened up, and the two of us spent the whole afternoon together, became friends, send each other text messages over Christmas and Easter. So I find that like it might be small, but I think it's in the largest scheme of things quite big, that especially in the current kind of like environment and climate, that we were able to have a family that was pretty anti-media and very pro-police change their perspective on things. Not that they are anti-police right now, but they do believe that you can be a little bit more critical of the handling of police, and you can definitely trust the media.
Yes.
And I think
Oh, sorry.
One thing about that. One thing I think the series did
will continue to do a really good job of is sort of alluding to or talking to people who have ideas for policy solutions. So watching a cut of the very excellent documentary today, the former medical examiner from Washington, D.C. talked about something would be pretty simple, which is on the standard death certificate, having a box that you might check when law enforcement was involved, whether they were at fault or not, just something like, that would allow people to track things better. One of the big findings of this was in something like 50% of these cases, law enforcement wasn't mentioned at all in the cause of death. You read deep into the autopsy, maybe, but just some little things like that I think could do a lot to help people understand the scale of this going forward.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to get in your business a little bit. Aside from the professional, with the professional, how did it impact, or was there an impact personal around this? What kept you up at night, if it did? I don't want to assume that. Did that change anything within you going? And I'm looking at what is
Yeah, so I think hands down the biggest thing that I experienced that was really tough was watching body camera footage, and not just watching it, once seeing it pop up on your social media, but really watching it, and watching it to the point that you have, memories of things that you heard or things that you saw in that footage. And so that definitely was something that kept me up at night. It was something that I also kind of had to carry with me when I was talking with family, was that, I, in some ways, knew a lot of intimate details about their life, but really all I knew was about the death of their loved one. And so, I felt like I knew these cases, front and back, but then I was coming to people with this information, really not knowing anything about their family or their loved one. One of the other cases that I was involved with reporting on was actually a father of four who was killed in a police encounter, and I met his partner, his children, and having to just kind of bear that responsibility of being the one breaking that news to a certain extent, and also just having the responsibility of being the one who is going to tell that story to the world, and just really, really wanting to get it right. Like, I don't take that lightly at all. And even still, like, now that, it's 5 days away from the whole project being put out there, I am still, like, just hoping and praying that the people that took the time to let me into their home, let me meet their children, let me meet their mother, believe that it was worth it. I think that's the thing that really stuck with me the most.
Yes, ma'am.
So my question really, so you mentioned the importance of reform and kind of reinvesting money into services other than the police that can answer like mental illnesses. Have you seen examples of police departments or areas that kind of have seen improvements in reforming and reinvesting? I know I'm from Baltimore, so when Freddie Gray died and the DOJ opened an investigation, they had a consent decree that they did, and after that they have seen improvement. Opinions about that, but have you seen examples of different areas forming?
Yeah, there definitely is some research. It's still pretty small right now, because while reinvestment isn't a new thing, it's kind of only in the recent years we've seen such great federal investment into local communities doing this type of work. But there's some promising stories. I think the most popular one that's referred to is out of Oregon right now. But I'm hopeful that in the kind of coming years we're going to see more in terms of research and evidence. But I would say right now, though, the research does show that in general, wraparound services, when you're thinking about reducing crime and violence, and if police are responsible for showing up to incidents of crime and violence, and we do see wraparound services can reduce that. I would say the one thing that I'm always cautious of, while I think it is important to reinvest money into other kind of service providers that are going to come out and not use force or not have weapons and things like that, we also don't want to make the same mistake where we are kind of perpetuating the systemic inequities in just a different system, right? And so there's still possibilities that, you know, institutionalizing people, for instance, if we're sending mental health professionals out, is still harmful for Black and brown communities. So that's not necessarily the thing to do, but I think in designing these new programs and policies, people on the grounds, people involved in communities are really mindful of that and have been investing services, particularly in the ones I'm more familiar about are like community violence interruption programs, for instance. And so I think there's some promising evidence coming.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word. Thank you, Dr. Allen. But that doesn't mean that the conversation stopped. We're gonna have like just an event outside here, so it is outside, right? Okay. So didn't want to pass on some disinformation there. But I really do again want to thank the panelists for this great conversation. I hope that people will, if you haven't read the project, I hope that you will read it. Please do watch the film on next Tuesday. And thank you all for coming. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. Bye.